We used to say what happens in the tent stays in the tent, but now we are Zooming the hour of response. So we did ask the speakers, and they all agreed that that would be fine, that we were recording this as well. But this has always been a very intimate space for our community. Once it moved into the main sanctuary, it was a little less intimate, but it's good to be in the main sanctuary today on a very cold day. We also have so many people here, we have far outgrown the tent. So I appreciate the intimacy of this room and the warmth that our community has created over the years, even in a very large space like this one. You know, there are about 1,300 chairs in here, I think. So you can get a sense of the size of this room. Sometimes it's deceiving because of the way that we're able to arrange it. I just want to acknowledge this is my 24th year at Temple Beth Elohim, which is pretty amazing to me because my predecessor, Rabbi Ron Weiss, served 24 years, and I thought that was a crazy amount of time. I share that because I inherited the hour of response. This was something that pre-existed my arrival, and immediately it embodied for me what Temple Beth Elohim was all about. A really caring community filled with very honest and supportive relationships where people could come and really dig in deep and share the depth of their souls and receive tremendous support in response. I don't think heartfelt prayer can actually take place without an honest, intimate, supportive community as a prerequisite. I think that's why even sometimes the best places for prayer fail at it, because it's not about the liturgy or the music, really. It's about the sense of support amidst the congregation that provides that loving embrace for people to really look inside and reveal themselves. And so I'm deeply grateful for whoever created the hour of response. But I'd like to think that Rabbi Weiss played a part in its creation. And so I think of him at this time. We have 3 speakers, as we've had. It's always been called the hour of response, although there is no response. Then we started, and it's never an hour. Then we started to call it spiritual autobiographies. But whatever we call it, each year, we learn a little bit about 3 individuals in our community in a way that's very often modernity does not allow. And very often the relationships created in this space continue long after Yom Kippur and deepen through the years. So I am grateful for all 3 speakers. The first speaker I would like to invite is very familiar to many of us because she has welcomed many of us to Temple Beth Elohim. And I thought it was her time to share with us for the hour of response. So first, I would like to call upon Susan Karen to share with us tonight. Let not this lectern be daunting. We were on the floor last year, but with the large numbers, we're up here.
I might need a stool, or mitzvah stool. On June 19th, 1995, I embarked on a journey that I never knew I needed. I had answered an ad in the Middlesex News a few weeks before for an admin at a small temple in Wellesley. I thought, sign me up. No nights, no weekends, no stress. To quote a Yiddish proverb, man plans and God laughs. I grew up in Newton, the South Side, where the schools were 98% Jewish. My parents both grew up in Orthodox homes and didn't want that lifestyle for their children. My father was born in Brooklyn, grew up in Leominster, and became bar mitzvah at the Eldred Street Shul. I never met my grandfather, and my grandmother passed away when I was 10. My mother grew up in Roxbury. My grandmother, who I believe instilled in me my love of Judaism, was an accomplished artist as well as a pianist and violinist for the Boston Women's Symphony. She always made sure we celebrated the holidays, and always with very good traditional food. Her paintings hang in our apartment, especially the one she painted for me as a child, The Shoemaker and the Elves. In our dining room hangs a painting of a rabbi next to paintings of the Shuk in Jerusalem. My grandfather, who was blinded at the age of 13, sold law books to put himself through law school. He had a village that consisted of Tip O'Neill and John McCormick and was a state rep of Roxbury for 22 years. He was my hero. Every Sunday, my nanny and papa took a taxi from Brookline to Newton with bags of fresh breads and bagels and lox and whitefish and everything imaginable from the bakery and nearby deli. I would love to be in the car while my father drove them home at night. And when I got my license, I would drive my nanny home. My senior year in high school, April vacation was canceled due to the blizzard of '78. But I took it off anyway. I spent 1 week with my nanny in Tampa, just she and me. It was a perfect week and one that I have always cherished, as she passed away the following Rosh Hashanah. The phone call came from my mother as I was participating in sorority rush. She was crying and told me I needed to come home. Nanny needed me. That phone call would be duplicated 44 years later when I had to call Michael and tell him his beloved papa was dying and he needed to come home. I heard my mother's voice in my head when I made that call. Well, my older brother became bar mitzvah at Temple Israel in 1968. My parents left there soon after, and in 1970, joined Temple Shalom. I became very active, became bat mitzvah, graduated Hebrew school, confirmation, and post-confirmation, as well as participating in the first Madrachim teaching assistant program through the Bureau of Jewish Education. I had a love for Rabbi Rothman, who stood much like Moses on the bima, with his head full of white hair matching his mustache and beard, his deep voice bellowing throughout the sanctuary. I think when I told Rabbi Weiss in my interview how much I loved Rabbi Rothman, it was then he decided to hire me. I have wonderful memories of my nanny making me sit in the front row of the sanctuary for High Holy Day services so she could hear Rabbi Rothman. It never failed. She would always fall asleep and begin to snore. My grandparents never went to Israel, but their love and devotion of all things Jewish was evident in their daily lives. They continued keeping a kosher home. They lived next door to Temple Zion in Brookline and went often. And while it wasn't the Mishkan Tefillah they knew and were very active in when they lived in Roxbury, my grandfather being president of the Brotherhood, they honored their roots and continued the traditions they grew up with. I became very active in Nefti, attending Shulins, conclavettes, Levi Leap, and the all-important summer and winter institutes. Throughout my Nefti years, I had a major crush on a guy named Rich. Turns out this guy is a temple member and the father of our own dear Rabbi Jordy. I don't know where he is. While growing up in the very Jewish community of Newton and being so immersed in the community of Temple Shalom, I would spend my summers at Camp Matoka. Not a Jewish camp like Eisner or Ramah, but owned by Jewish neighbors of ours. The campers were all Jewish, and I have the fondest memories of Friday nights singing Sabbath prayer, lighting the Shabbat candles, having chicken for dinner, and then everyone dressed in their whites would assemble in the council ring for Shabbat services. Friday nights at camp and all my time spent in Nefti helped to fuel my love for Judaism and all things Jewish. I always felt proud to be a Jew, and because I was very sheltered, I didn't know anything else. It was time for college. I ended up at American University, Tel Aviv on the Potomac, where the percentage of Jews living on campus was 50%. I chose to major in Judaic studies. Why? Because I could easily pass beginner Hebrew to take care of my foreign language requirement. Years later, my mother suggested I go to rabbinical school. I didn't want any more school at that point, and while I aced beginning Hebrew, I would never have made it through any more Hebrew classes. When I talk to her these days, sitting at the grave, I tell her that while I am not a rabbi, sometimes I'm actually more important than they are. I'm so glad you all know that. After working for UJA in DC for 3 years, it was now 1984 and time to move back home. My first job was with JNF. Then after 1 year, CJP poached me as a campaign associate. It was then that I met Jeff as we played volleyball each week with B'nai B'rith young adults. His friends didn't like me much. I always only had a $20 bill to pay the $2 admission fee. My nails were very long and always polished, so each time I went to hit a ball, someone would scream, "Oh my God, she broke a nail." Somehow we ignored the naysayers and have just celebrated our 36th wedding anniversary. That's for him, actually. When we got engaged, my mother wanted us to get married at the Newton Marriott. I said, absolutely not. We will be married and celebrate at Temple Shalom, the place where I learned to grow Jewishly, where all my life cycle events took place. Rabbi Rothman was to officiate, and memories of my nanny and papa were with me as I walked down the aisle. As I dealt with my first bout of infertility, I remember being at services at our former temple, Temple Israel in Natick. A friend of mine said, "How can you have any hope that you will get pregnant?" I told her if I give up hope, I will lose everything. I knew in my heart that I would become pregnant. I loved being pregnant, and while my body refused to let me carry another baby, I have always felt that Michael filled a void that I didn't know I had. He was born the spitting image of my father, something my mother could never see. But my life changed that day. I was asked once when Michael was very young if I would travel to Israel now that I am a mother. It was a tough question because up to that point I had been 3 times. I had done things like tubing down the Jordan River, flying in a 6-seater plane, and been there while bombs have been going off in front of me. And while my heart is and always will be in Israel, I had to say no, at least when he was so young. I did go back to Israel when he was in high school, not worrying then if anything were to happen to me. Michael went on birthright and learned for himself why I love that country so much. Jeff had never been until 2019 when we went with the TBE group, and now he understands why our hearts are there. In 2000, our lives changed forever. My mother had an accident in Florida, and after 1 week in the hospital, she took a medevac plane home. She spent the next 5 months in and out of the hospital, but she couldn't go home, too many stairs. So my parents sold my childhood home. We sold our home in Natick, and we moved together to a big house in Sudbury. My heart said to always honor your mother and father, and this was the best way I knew how. My mother passed in 2006, a year and a half before Michael became bar mitzvah. My father and Michael's best friend passed last summer. It was heartbreaking for us all, and I am still having trouble coming to terms with it. You can read my thing in the October Bulletin. In 1972, I made the honor roll at camp, not for best all-around camper or most likely to do whatever, but for service. I was 12 years old and had no idea what that meant. But over 50 years later, I realized how smart those counselors were to nominate me for that award. Every job I have ever had has been to help people. UJA, JNF, CJP, travel agent, TBE, with a few years of Boston Popcorn and helping a friend at his dry cleaners. When I have had thoughts of leaving TBE, I dig deep down and I think, I just want to help people. I just want everybody to be happy. And while together we have been through many simchas and celebrations, we have also been through unimaginable tragedies. But every day, no matter what gets thrown at me, I always feel like I am helping someone. The week before I began my job, Elaine Lawrence, the executive director, who is Zooming today, called me. I said, "Are you reneging on your offer?" She laughed and said no. Rabbi Weiss is having the staff for dinner next week, and I wanted to extend the invitation to you and Jeff and give you time to find a babysitter. It was during that phone call I realized I was heading into something very special. Elaine once told me that I could do wonderful things at TBE. I never believed her until recently. Well, I think we all do wonderful things together at TBE. I know that when someone feels comfortable enough to cry on my shoulder or to say to me when I answer the emergency phone, "Thank God it's you," I realize that I do make a difference. As I approach my 30th year at TBE, I think back to the beginning. I had a 1-year-old at home. I really expected to work 5 years and leave. I cannot ever imagine leaving this community. While I've had thoughts about it over the years, I realize that there is no place like home, be it TBE or Israel, and for that, I am incredibly blessed.
Susan, thank you. Take a deep breath. Give you a heart tap on Zoom and in the sanctuary. Our second speaker is Rabbi Julie Wolkoff. Julie, where are you? There you are.
If I were my grandson, I would say, "I hide it." I'm a Midwesterner, third generation Minnesota born. My grandmothers, my parents, my siblings, and I were all born in the Twin Cities. 6 of my great-grandparents are buried in St. Paul, as are 3 of my grandparents and my parents. My parents grew up in the Twin Cities. Their families were involved in the Reform synagogues. My father's family at Mount Zion in St. Paul, my mother's at Temple Israel in Minneapolis. My parents attended the University of Minnesota, where they were active in a Jewish fraternity and sorority, and that is how they met. My Judaism and my political beliefs are both shaped by and deeply rooted in my Minnesota upbringing, and in the fact that my great-grandmother died from an illegal abortion when my grandmother was 3. We belonged to Temple Israel, a classical Reform synagogue, and when my rabbi, Max Shapiro, Zichrona Livracha, preached about topical issues, his words fit hand in glove with the liberal politics of my home state. He was also the finest pastoral rabbi I ever knew, an inspiration for me as I became a rabbi, and a great supporter for me in that process. As a child, I was a voracious reader and question asker. Not loud enough?
Hold in the back.
Okay, thanks. And perhaps a bit of a rebel. When we studied other religions in Sunday school, I complained that my teacher should have brought in people from the other religions because he couldn't answer all my questions. He responded that God himself could not answer all my questions. In public school, my 3rd grade teacher would not allow me to take a specific book out of the school library. She didn't give me a reason. I took the book out of the public library and brought it to school to read during free reading time. And if you asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would tell you a children's librarian. Every summer, my mom made it clear that we could not be in the house. We had to be outside with friends or go to the nearby park where there were activities. And several times a week, I would take my bike and ride to the local branch library. It was a small one-room library, maybe as big as, like, from Joel to the Wall. And at some point, I had read or reread most of the children's books, so I wandered over to the adult section and started taking out adult books. I learned later that the librarian called my mother and asked if it was okay for me to do that. My mom had a degree in library science and had been a librarian before she was pregnant with me. And my mom said if I understood the books, it was okay for me to take them out and read them. There was no problem. And if I didn't understand the books, they wouldn't cause me any harm. When I was 13, my parents got divorced. And divorce was less common then, or at least it wasn't discussed. The only one I knew, actually I was the only one I knew other than my siblings who were going through this. There weren't support services, we didn't talk about it, we just kind of muddled through it. And what I remember the most is that Thanksgiving and Passover celebrations changed. We didn't have any continuity from holiday to holiday until 3 years later when my mom remarried. For me, the disruption of this divorce led to strong connections with my peers as a source of support later that year when I joined our Temple Youth Group. We were part of NOFTY, the Northern Federation of Temple Youth, and I have very fond memories of long bus rides from Minneapolis to Milwaukee or to Oconomowoc for conclaves. And it was at one of those conclaves that I first studied Jewish texts. They were a revelation to me. I was so hooked. I was fascinated by the world of the rabbis, by the arguments that spanned time and place, by the rabbis' ability to interpret and reinterpret texts while keeping in mind the needs of the people who they were affected by the issues they discussed. I knew then that I wanted to keep learning these texts. My youth group involvement and the passion about what we learned led me to decide that I wanted to become a rabbi. I was 15 or 16. I must have also heard about Sally Priesand, as there was much publicity in those years about her upcoming ordination as the first woman to be ordained by a rabbinic seminary. In my senior year of college, a recruiter from Hebrew Union College came to the University of Minnesota. I met with him and he encouraged me to apply. I applied, was accepted, and in 1977, at 21, I went to Israel for my first year of rabbinical school. At that time, Hebrew Union College had ordained 3 women, Sally Priesand, Michal Mendelson, and Laura Geller. And the Reconstructionist Rabbinical School had just ordained Sandy Sasso. It was a challenging time. Reactions from people who heard I was studying to be a rabbi were, how sweet. Can girls do that? And of course, oh, you're studying to be a rebbitzin. It was also very clear that the individual choices we made impacted how people saw all women in the rabbinate. In my first student pulpit, a congregant told me they had already had a woman student, and they hadn't been that happy with her, and they weren't enthusiastic about having another woman. By the way, no one has ever said, we had a male rabbi once, it didn't work, we're going to hire women. During my entire time at HUC, the women students significantly outnumbered the ordained women. In 1982, when my class was ordained, we brought the total of women ordained at HUC to 49. We were each other's role models, often looking to classmates or colleagues just a few years older for support or inspiration. I didn't have a job when I was ordained, and a few weeks later, I got a call from a small congregation in a college town in the South. They explained that they hadn't called me earlier because I was too young, too inexperienced, single, and female. And then they invited me for an interview. I went, I was offered the job, I turned it down. I didn't feel comfortable with them, and I didn't think the job would last beyond the original contract. I ended up at a small congregation in Troy, New York, that needed someone for weekends and B'nai Mitzvah. It was a 6-month job. They and I were both in placement, and to my surprise, they offered me the position. I accepted. I liked being a congregational rabbi, but after 12 years, I felt I had done as much as I could in Troy, and it was time for something different. I was also in a Doctor of Ministry program and had 1 year to finish the work to get my degree. So I cobbled together several chaplaincy and teaching jobs and finished my DMin. One of the jobs, the best job I ever had, was with an HIV/AIDS care team program. It was before protease inhibitors, when AIDS was a death sentence. We worked with churches and synagogues to develop and train care teams. And people had a lot of reasons for joining the care teams. They may have known someone, they may have felt a religious call. In some cases, it was because their church was not ready to be open to people who were LGBTQ. So we would match them with one of our patients. They would provide non-medical support services. So the story I usually tell is that one of our teams, their care partner was a young girl, and every time she and her mother had to go down to NIH for clinical trials, her siblings went into foster care. Every time her siblings went into foster care, their care team drove them every day to and from school so they wouldn't have to change schools. For staff support, our director would say, "How are you doing? Where were we struggling?" He would give us bookstore gift cards, but the instruction was we had to buy something that was not related to our job, something that would feed our souls. And this is where I also learned about ministry of presence. To be fully, deeply, really present in the moment, without focus on or worry about what was going to happen next, especially when I felt uncomfortable. It was and still is a profound spiritual practice that I still find challenging at times. And when I left that job, I knew I wanted to work with hospice at the end of my career because it was the only other kind of healthcare I knew that dealt with the whole family. One evening in the fall of 1997, I was at the Schenectady Midrashah, where I taught, and before classes began, a friend came up to me and said, "My cousin Bobby's getting divorced. Can I give him your name?" I said, "Sure." She sent off her email. About 5 months later, I got an email from this guy named Bob saying he'd be in Schenectady for his cousin's son's bar mitzvah in April, and he hoped to meet me. I don't remember if I met him after services, but we were seated at the same table that night at the party. The party, half of the people were from Schenectady at that table, and the other half were my friend's cousins. Bob and I spoke for most of the evening. When the party was over, my friend invited me to join them the next day at her house for brunch, and I came, and Bob and I spent our time talking to each other. I felt really badly that I monopolized his time when he was there to be with family. He told me months later how grateful he was that I was there so he didn't have to deal with his family. He called me the next week and invited me, well, actually what he said was some friends in Schenectady had invited him for the weekend, and would I like to have dinner with him on Saturday? And I said yes. I also learned years later that his friends had not invited him. He had called them and said he had met a woman and he wanted to take her to dinner and could he stay overnight at their house. We started seeing each other, some weeks in Albany, some weeks in Wellesley. And in the spring of 1999, as we were walking through my neighborhood in Albany, he said, "What would it take to move you to Wellesley?" And I said, "A job, or July." It made sense to me. The jobs where I had a contract ended in June, and my lease was up in July. And that makes it sound a little bit easier than it was. It was mostly an easy decision. We wanted to be together. Bob owned a house, had a child, had an elderly mother in Newton. I was renting an apartment in Albany where I had no local family. So it made sense, but there was a cost to the move. I'd been in the Capital District for 16 years, and I was leaving friends, a regular Talmud study group, the conservative synagogue that was my spiritual home, and a job I loved. So I moved to Wellesley in July of 1999 with a job in place at the New Jewish High School of Greater Boston, teaching Jewish thought and advising the liberal minyan. I didn't know where I would be making a spiritual connection. Bob was a member of TBE. He strongly believed that it was important to join the congregation in your town and that it was important for his daughter to go to synagogue with the people she went to school with. He went on the high holidays, and that was it. And it turned out I didn't actually feel the need at that point for a congregational connection. I was working at a day school, first part-time, then full-time as the director of Judaic activities. I had plenty of Jewish prayer, study, and activity in my life. I had a few jobs providing sabbatical coverage, a regular high holiday job, so I would come to TBE with Bob on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. In 2007, my job at Gann Academy was eliminated, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to stay in Jewish education or move into chaplaincy. It became clear to me that I was most excited by the opportunities in the hospice field. My AIDS care team job had prepared me for this, and I was eager to work with patients and families again. One of the great joys I have in hospice work, and challenges, is that every day, every visit is different. With some people, I pray and bless people. With others, we talk about their lives or current affairs. And a visit can go from very casual to deeply spiritual in the snap of a hand. I regularly have the privilege of having conversations like this with people and families. And I also joined a spiritual direction group that year. So every month from September to June, we met in person, now on Zoom. And our spiritual director brings in texts or prayers and questions, and we reflect and share what speaks to us. It's helped me with the transitions in my life. It's helped me to see when God is present, where I'm stuck, where I'm changing. It helps me reflect on the work I do and see the spirituality in it. Last week, we began our 17th year together. And once I was working outside the Jewish world, I wanted to have a stronger connection with TBE. For me, the entry point was the caring community knitters. And then, when this building was in place, I began to attend Friday night services. Bob's job was in Stoneham, and he wouldn't get home on Fridays till about 6:45, so I would come here and then go home, and we'd go out for dinner or eat at home. And that was pretty much my life until May of 2013. Around the beginning of that month, Bob got pneumonia. He was on medication, but not getting much better. In the early hours of May 18th, he felt short of breath, but it resolved pretty quickly. And that day, Saturday, he took his car in for an oil change. He went for a haircut, and he bought a lottery ticket. It was not a winning ticket, unfortunately. And mid-afternoon, he was again short of breath. I took him to Needham to BID, and they sent him to Boston, where the plan was to intubate him and address the pneumonia. And they intubated him. It was successful, and then he had a heart attack. They were doing CPR. They brought in a cardiologist, and it was clear to him that they needed to do an angioplasty. It was a long shot, but he was 60 and healthy. After the angioplasty, they moved him to the CCU, and they got him in a bed, and we were going to go home. And then I heard the doctor start calling for the same medication they had been calling for in the ER. He told us that Bob was going to code again, and we knew we had to let him go. I found some comfort knowing that having the heart attack in the ER of BID in Boston gave him the best possible care and chance to survive. He had had cancer 40 years earlier, something he never talked about. And ironically, the radiation that helped save him when he was in his early 20s was what gave him the heart attack and killed him when he was 60. I was so grateful that I had, and that we had, a congregation to turn to. I also knew that Sunday morning was mitzvah day, and the clergy would be busy. So about 4 o'clock in the morning, I sent an email to Rabbi Sissenwein and Cantor Sufrin. And I will never forget how helpful and supportive the clergy and the congregation were. That day, during the funeral, Shiva, every week at services, and really ever since. A few months after Bob's death, I wrote, I knew the value of faith, community, and congregation before I was bereaved. I now know how much more personally, how very, very valuable they are, how important we are to one another. I am thankful that I have deep roots in each one. Those words continue to ring true to me, and I am so very, very grateful to be a part of this community.
Just want to say Bob's daughter is now a member of our Board of Trustees. Let's take a deep... Let's take a deep breath for our final speaker. Another extraordinary hour. Mike Sinnert. Mike.
Shana Tova. It's kind of hard to stand up here after those two extraordinary speakers. It's an honor to be up here, though. I want to thank Joel for inviting me. I also want to thank my family for putting up with me these last few weeks as I worked on this talk. I don't think I was very easy to live with. I told Susan Karen the other day that I had about a 45-minute talk, and she told me I had to cut, which I have done, so I promise I won't keep you for 45 minutes. But my name is Mike Sinnert, along with my wife Erica, my kids Annie and Ari, who are now 23 and 17. I've been a member of the TBE community for nearly 18 years. Although we've been around TBE for far longer than that. Erica grew up here. Her photo is on the wall, her confirmation photo is on the wall upstairs, along with her brother, those are her brothers, Josh and Dan. We were married 26 years ago by Rabbi Weiss, but not in the old building because I think, as every longtime member knows, no center aisle. I'm going to ask everyone to bear with me just a little bit. I'm not a great public speaker. I am a writer, though, and I tend to see the world in stories. And I'm hoping a few of the stories that I share this afternoon might be meaningful to you. I never thought I would end up at TBE or as a member of a congregation. When I was young, I never thought of myself as a person who would be living a Jewish life or as someone on a Jewish journey. If anything, I was really turned off by Judaism after my Hebrew school years, especially when Cantor Unger at Temple Sinai in Hollywood, Florida, where I went to Hebrew school, after my bar mitzvah, he caught me in the social hall playing football with my tefillin bag. No, it's true. Fire shot from the man's eyes. He was so furious with me. And honestly, I'll never forget the scolding. My father used to say that Temple Sinai reminded him of his own synagogue growing up. And to this day, I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it surely was not TBE. So I was raised in a Jewish home, but as a young child, a very young child, I don't remember my parents as particularly observant. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and I spent the early years of my childhood on Long Island. And in those early years before we moved to Florida, the closest I ever came to synagogue was the brisket and the noodle kugel my mom served at Rosh Hashanah, the bagels and lox at Breakfast, her latkes, her matzo ball soup at Passover. My early Jewish experience was really all about food. And food, in fact, would have a very outsized experience on my life as I got older. My childhood home looked warm and comfortable, well-fed. It looked very loving. And I think relatives and family friends to this day would describe it just that way. In truth, I never doubted that my parents loved me. But despite appearances, that loving Jewish childhood wasn't always a very safe childhood. My father, he was a podiatrist, but he was mercurial at best, explosive at worst. He was also raised in Brooklyn by a World War II veteran who worked as a custodian for the city. My dad's dad was angry. He often hit my father and his two brothers, and according to family lore, he regularly beat one of my uncles over his sexuality. My grandmother was apparently narcissistic and depressed, and she wasn't really able to function well as a parent. And with that kind of childhood, it's easy to see how my father was doomed to become kind of an intemperate, domineering, self-centered man himself. I first learned about my father's anger as a very young child when I was about 4, when my sister was born. As I said, we lived on Long Island at the time, and my grandparents on my mother's side, Nanny and Poppy, who I adored, would spend summers with us, sleeping on fold-out cots in our living room. When my mom was 9 months pregnant and she went into birthing labor, my nanny went into cooking labor. My mom was rushed off to the hospital. Nanny rushed into the kitchen. She had 6 pots and pans going on 4 burners. There was chicken soup, split pea soup, borscht. She had frying pans going with blintzes and pierogies. Everything was boiling over. Grease was splattering everywhere. It was a disaster, and honestly, it was a joy to behold. But when my dad came back from the hospital to tell me that I had a baby sister, he saw the mess in the kitchen, and he blew up. I was really too young to understand the words. As I said, I was only 4, but I could feel the tension. The arguing was really too loud to ignore. And I really distinctly remember sneaking off with a few of those, the sweet Blintz pancakes before they're stuffed. Nanny had them laid out on the table waiting to be filled, and I remember eating them alone in my bed, reading comic books and hearing the screaming going on in the kitchen. Even as a young child, it was obvious to me that so much of what went on in our house revolved around food. What was mom cooking for dinner? Which Chinese restaurant will we go to on Sunday? And I guess because of that, meals started to become kind of an escape for me. Food became soothing. And more than in just that sort of stereotypical, Jewish grandmother, oi, tatala, don't worry so much, eat something kind of way. A full stomach sort of became this defense against the tension around me, against my father's rage. When I was 10 years old, my father packed up the family and moved us from Long Island to Hollywood, Florida, where he joined a new medical practice. I never knew whether my mom actually wanted to go to Florida or not, but she was sort of that, go along to get along ilk. But I was uprooted from my friends, my home, all the family that we had in New York. Florida was kind of a strange place for me. I didn't really understand it. I couldn't get along with my teacher no matter how hard I tried. So I ate. I ate as much as I could in the school cafeteria at lunchtime. I ate at home after school. When my parents expressed concern about my weight, I just ate more behind their backs. But my growing waistline really didn't stop my mother from continuing to cook like a great Jewish mom is supposed to cook. She was incredibly adventurous in the kitchen, not only all of the typical Jewish delicacies that we think about, but she cooked Italian food, Chinese food. She had this great big wok in the kitchen years before woks became kind of common in American kitchens, and she cooked so many other things. There was one night, though, that I remember, maybe I was 14 years old, 15 years old. My dad came home from work, and Mom put out dinner. It was something new. Honestly, I don't remember what the dish was. It doesn't really matter, but it was one of the few times where her kitchen adventures had gone off the rails. It was gross. It was inedible. Honestly, not just inedible, but noxious, really awful. And I'm sitting across from my sister, Andrea. Andy holds up her fork, and there's something brown on the end. I might have tasted it. I don't think Andy tasted it, but Annie and I, we make vomit faces at each other. We're laughing because this is the least delicious meal my mother ever put on the table. And my mother's laughing too because she can't stand this stuff. But she's encouraging us to eat because that's what a Jewish mom is supposed to do. And she worked hard on whatever this brown yuch is. And it's her job to feed us, but she can't pick up her fork. And it's a funny family moment until my father slams down his fork and everything turns ugly. Suddenly, he and my mother are arguing. There's this huge explosion at the dinner table. Everything's heated and mean. Stereotypical dad comes home from a hard day at the office kind of stuff. "Stop screaming," my mother yells. "I'm not screaming," my father screams. There's a lot of back and forth. She wants to cook him something else. He insists she should have cooked him something decent in the first place. She's trying to reason, but he's yelling, not listening. He's gone. He's far gone. She grabs her purse and storms out, and there's silence for a while, finally. We might have cleared the table. I don't remember. My memory is kind of hazy, but I do know that my mom came back after a while with a box of fried chicken from the supermarket deli counter. And suddenly it's loud again. They're screaming. The chicken box goes flying, hits the window. Eventually, my sister and I escape to our rooms. I remember hours later, well after midnight, when everyone is asleep and the house was quiet, I went digging through the trash for that fried chicken and ate as much as I could, sitting alone on the floor in the garage. No one in my family ever talked about that fried chicken incident, and I'm sharing it to tell you that that kind of binging to suppress my feelings followed me through college and into adulthood. I was always a big kid, a big teen. By my 30s, I was well over 250 pounds, pushing 300. And it's hard to argue with food, right? It's part of our Jewish love language. In my case, food was the best drug a nice Jewish boy could find. It was safe. It didn't cross legal or moral boundaries. I didn't have to sneak off to some dark alley to buy it. It was right there in the kitchen or in the drive-thru of a fast food joint or the quiet back booth of some diner. And as I said, I want to be clear. I'm not really sharing this story to demonize anybody or to blame. I did that for 20 years in therapy. I'm trying to paint a picture of how a young, anxious child under stress from a domineering parent might grow into an anxious teenager, an anxious adult. By the time I met Erica and we got married, I was 27 years old and 300 pounds. By the time our son Ari was born, I was 37 and nearing what I call my peak obesity, nearly 350 pounds. And that kind of brings us to a point where my food journey, which I would later learn was binge eating disorder, intersects with my Jewish journey. After my bar mitzvah, back at Temple Sinai in Hollywood, I thought I was done with Judaism, done with organized religion. But then our son Ari was born, months and months premature. Ari was in the NICU at Beth Israel in Boston. Erica was sick. This was, unfortunately, the first major health crisis we went through as a family. I was binging one day in the cafeteria at Beth Israel when this crazy thought popped into my head. I'm supposed to organize a bris for my newborn son. How do I do that when he's so sick? Somehow I thought to call TBE. You'll remember Rabbi Weiss had married us. Erica grew up here. Is Rabbi Weiss there? I said to the person on the phone. No, he's retired, but you should speak to Joel. And suddenly I'm on the phone with Joel, who I've never met, doesn't know me. What do? I asked. Joel shared words of wisdom that I needed to hear. Within hours, Sharon Clevenger, the assistant rabbi at the time, appeared at the NICU with prayers and hugs. Erica was discharged and we had to leave Ari in the hospital. Sharon encouraged us to attend summer Shabbat services in the new atrium in the old building. Erica reconnected with Jody, whose first year at TBE was the year of Erica's bat mitzvah. The prayers in the new atrium were like meditation. I remember Annie dancing in the back of the new atrium while we were praying and listening to the songs. And somehow as a family, with the support of a newfound community, we made it through. And that's really the first thought I want to share, I want to leave you with, is community. I never thought I'd want to be part of a temple, as I said earlier. I didn't believe in prayer, or at least the kind of prayer I was taught growing up. And that's what I thought temple was all about, rote prayer. But I was wrong. Our family has fallen into health crises far too often. When I became deathly ill after weight loss surgery in 2010, my friend Beth Nast and the caring community brought meals to Erica and the kids, first for months, then for years. Rabbi Sapphire brought Annie to orthodontist appointments. She brought her to the orthopedist when Annie broke her wrist, and I think that falls way outside of normal rabbinical duties. Joel would show up at my hospital bed, sometimes in his TBE softball uniform, rushing off the field when he knew I needed support. The TBE community has embraced us in ways I can't explain, ways that to this day fill my heart with love and gratitude. And in turn, we've tried to embrace that. We've tried to return the embrace. I honestly don't think it's possible to get through this life without community. When I look at my life, I can say that while I belong to multiple and sometimes overlapping communities, the town where we live, Needham, the Boston literary community, and other communities, it's the TBE community where I am most at home and where I feel I most belong. TBE is also where I have found some of my closest friends. Not long after we joined, after Ari was home from the NICU and thriving, he's now that 17-year-old bearded guy over there, Annie started at TBE Hebrew School. Sharon Clevenger said to Erica, let's start a Havarah. For 17 years, one Saturday night a month, we've been having family dinners with the Wolfsons, the Lees, the Clevengers, the Budsons, the Spitzes. We've watched each other's kids grow up. We've helped each other through too many family emergencies and shared so many mitzvahs and joys together. After so much time, I can honestly say we all love each other. And that Havarah is only one part of my TBE circle of friends. Ask me about my traveling companions in Israel last year, or the men's club and softball guys, or the TBE breakfast boys I meet up with the diner in Natick every month. And that brings me to my final thought, which is prayer. As I said earlier, I'm really not a huge praying type. I love the music at services and sometimes the ritual. Honestly, all these years later, I'm still not sure I was that far out of line playing tefillin football back when I was 13, despite Cantor Unger's rebuke. I think symbols are fine, but I don't think that God is in those tefillin or in the prayer books that are under your chairs or in the Torah scrolls back here. I think God is in our actions, in the way we live our lives, in the way we model ourselves for our children, in the way this community has repeatedly turned itself out to help my family when we've needed it, and the way my family and I continually try to help others. To me, that is the essence of prayer, and that is how I see my own Jewish journey, just trying to eat a little less and trying to make the world a little better. I hope that sharing my story has made it a little better today. Thank you. Lashana Tova.
This is where I would always turn to Jody and say, can't we just sing something? Let's take a break, everyone. But first of all, thank you, Susan, Julie, and Mike, for sharing your stories. I can't think of a more powerful hour and a better way to spend time together on Yom Kippur afternoon. Let's take a 10-minute break or 15-minute break, and we'll resume at 4:30 with Mincha, our afternoon service. Thank you all.